Welcome, everyone, to the first episode of the Under25 Podcast. Today's guest is Edwin Dorsey. Edwin is the creator and writer behind The Bear Cave, a short focused newsletter that's followed by over 15,000 people, including many hedge funds and investors on Wall Street. Edwin has been written about in the Wall Street Journal, Institutional Investor, and was most recently on CNBC's TechCrunch. Edwin, thanks so much for being here.
Chase, thanks so much for having me as your first guest on the Under 25 podcast. I'm really excited to be here.
Absolutely. So Edwin, you're 23 years old and you've been writing this newsletter for about 18 months now. And last time I checked, you have over 750 paid subscribers and it was generating around 300,000 in recurring revenue. Give us a sense of how this all got started, maybe your background and how you got interested in investing to begin with.
Absolutely. So there's a lot to talk about. I've always been passionate about stocks from a really young age. Like in second grade, I was really interested in stocks. What took it to another level for me is my grandmother put a little bit of money in an E-Trade account and gave me the username and password and just let me invest real money for her. And I was hooked from there, and I had no idea what I was doing. Playing with real money is fun. I would write a little online about stocks. And then freshman year of college is really when I made the transition more to the short side. Early freshman year, I was introduced to Mark Cahotas and Jim Carruthers, who are two of the best short sellers out there. Jim ran a short only fund called Sophos Capital Management, which was about $1 billion short only. And I interned there on and off for my 4 years of college. And they really tutored me and showed me the ropes, how to find SEC filings, find lawsuits, file FOIA requests, how to really dig into a company and understand it. But you know, when people graduate from college, they got to get a job. Sophos wasn't hiring, and I think they're in the process of converting to a family office or downsizing. And I wanted to be in New York City, so I started talking to all these New York City hedge funds, and I just right away realized like I don't like wearing suits, I don't like structure, I like a lot of freedom. I don't know if I could have a boss telling me what to do all day. And most New York City hedge funds approach stuff differently than I did. I decided I wanted to try to be independent and see if it would work. So I was doing this newsletter first as just a free weekly thing to talk about what's going on in the activist short space and things I found interesting because there's so many short sellers now. And it just started taking off. The first week there was 300 people. By like week 10, there was 3,000. Now there's 17,000 people on the free list. In September, I launched paid subscriptions, where for a paid subscriber, now it's like $44 a month. On the first and third Thursday every month, I'll publish a deep dive, usually on a company that's misleading investors or misleading customers, usually centered around some FOIA requests I filed. And that just took off right away. Within 2 months, it was earning over 100K. The Substack, the email newsletter company's CEO reached out to me and saying, "How are you growing so fast?" So, you know, I was just blown away by how well it worked. And it's honestly the dream job for any 23-year-old. I can sleep in as much as I want. I don't have a boss. I learn a ton. It's a great networking tool. And I get invited to some cool under 25 podcasts. So it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, that's awesome, Edwin. And that last part is why I wanted to have you on, because I think it's really unique, how you've done this by yourself. And I really want to dig and dive deep on the newsletter. But before we get into that, maybe could we talk about the relationship that you have with Mark Cahotas and Jim Carruthers? Because I hear, and based off the other interviews that you've done, that there's some interesting stories behind how you're able to network with those guys. And I just thought that those stories were pretty funny. And there's also maybe talk about the hedge fund in San Francisco, and you even convinced Bill Ackman to sit down with you at one point. So can you share some of those stories?
So Chase, I've always thought it's really important, especially when you're young, to like try to meet people and advocate for yourself, and like I said, get your face in front of people so they can see you. So Mark, some young person said, "Oh, you should meet Mark Cahotas. Here's his phone number," and I just kept cold calling him, and then eventually got on the phone. And at first he was really gruff. He's like, "Who the hell is this calling?" And then I tried to explain, and eventually he's like, "Okay, you seem a little smart. You can come up to my chicken farm in Northern Cal." And I Ubered up to his chicken farm. It was like $100 Uber, But when you're a freshman in college, you can't really rent the car easily. And we meet for like 2 hours, and he's like, okay, make a Twitter account. I'll tweet about you and get you your first 100 followers. And that's what I did. And that's how I started, building a Twitter audience. Jim Carruthers, I was writing a Seeking Alpha blog, and I think he read it. But I was writing it anonymously. So he didn't know like it was some 18-year-old freshman writing it. He thought it was like some professional dude in Stanford, California. So he reached out to me being like, hey, I'd love to take you to lunch and like learn more about who you are. And I walk in as an 18-year-old and he's like, oh my goodness, like who is this? So that was Jim. The two stories you kind of highlighted are probably the most extreme examples. There was a hedge fund in San Francisco I wanted to meet. And yeah, I just kept emailing them and they just never responded. So one day I had nothing to do, no classes. So I take a train up to San Francisco and I go into their lobby of this big, beautiful building. And I'm like to the doorman, I need to go to the 45th floor to talk to this hedge fund. And he's like, do you have an appointment? And I said, no. And I'm like, just let me up. I want to talk to them. And he's like, no way, you can't get up without an appointment. I'm like, just call and see if they'll meet me. And he's like, no, but I wasn't deterred. So I sat down in the lobby. I went on LinkedIn and I just started randomly LinkedIn messaging all these people at this hedge fund saying, I'm in your lobby. I'm a freshman in college. I want to meet you. I have a stock pitch for you. And eventually someone responded and let me up. And they're like, we thought you were either going to rob us or you're a really unique kid. So, and then Bill Ackman, when I was in Stanford in New York, which is like our study abroad program in New York City, that last 3 months, I made it a habit to try to reach out to one new person every day, just cold email one person, usually in finance. So at first I go down like the list of Stanford alums in finance, and then I go for the big hedge fund managers. And I cold emailed Bill Ackman. My subject line, Chase, was fan mail, because I knew everyone would open something with fan mail. And he responded within like 10 minutes. He's like, my secretary will set something up. And we met for like 45 minutes, and it was an awesome meeting. And he introduced me to one of his analysts, and he was a very nice and wicked sharp guy. Like, one thing I noticed with some of these big people is they just get concepts really quickly and they care about their time. So they want to shuffle through a lot quickly, but he was very nice.
Gotcha. Yeah, the fan mail, the fan mail tip is something that I'll keep with me. That's so funny. Yeah, so I think a good place to start would be just to talk about what short selling is and why it's important, because it seems like for the most part, the people who pay attention to the research that you do are short sellers. So I think that would be a good place to start.
Chase, absolutely. So short selling is a way to bet against a company. Mechanically, the way it works is you find someone who owns a stock. You tell them, hey, you own 10 shares of Apple. Can I borrow those shares and give them back to you at a future date? And I'll pay you a small fee for the inconvenience. You borrow those 10 shares from them. You sell them at the current price, let's say 100. Hopefully the share price falls to 80. You buy them back and return them to the original owner. You've just profited because you sold it for 100 and you bought it back at a lower price of 80. So you profit $20 less any fee you pay for the inconvenience of borrowing it. Now, for the owner, he was going to own Apple stock anyways, regardless of whether it goes up or down. So he's okay doing this because he has a slightly higher return because of the fee. Now, the flip side is if you short a stock and it goes up, you still need to cover it, buy it back at a higher price. So there's unlimited potential downside. These stocks could go up to infinity. So that's kind of mechanically how shorting works. It's just expressing a bet against a company. There's really two types of short sellers. There's passive short sellers who will do research on a company and say, hey, I think it's overvalued. I think it's going to go down for this reason. Let me short it. And then there's more activist short sellers who do this similar research, really think a company is doing something egregious or way overvalued. We'll take a big short position and then we'll put out a report saying, here's why the 10 reasons why this company is bad or why it's a fraud or whatever they're doing wrong, and sometimes catalyze the stock price to go down and, get the market to realize and then cover and make a profit. The reason it's important is in many ways, short sellers are kind of like the regulators of today's markets. Regulators are great at piecing together what happened after the fact and are great at pushing for greater disclosure. But if you look, like a lot of the big frauds or like financial misconduct has been at least first exposed by short sellers. A great example is Nikola, where it seems like the SEC only got involved in this, natural gas truck company when the short seller put out a big report on it. So short sellers can act kind of like a regulator. They can also be a balance in downtimes if the market falls a lot. The only buyers sometimes are short sellers.
Right. And what's interesting about what you do is that your reports are more focused on exposing the misconduct as opposed to putting on the positions yourself. So you have more of an unbiased approach. I guess, why have you made the decision to take the trades out of it and just post the research as opposed to profiting from it yourself?
So Chase, you're absolutely right. With the Bear Cave newsletter, I don't bet against the companies I write about. On rare occasions, if I highlight a long idea, I might own the stock and disclose I own it, but I don't bet against the stocks I write about. There's a few reasons. One, I'm young. I don't have a huge balance sheet. I'm not a multimillionaire. So it just, if I was shorting it, it probably wouldn't even be that profitable. I also just don't like the concept of short it right before a report and cover after. That just doesn't feel always right to me, but that's kind of how you do it usually when you're putting out reports. That's another reason. I do think it helps your credibility a lot if you say, hey, I'm not taking a position, but these are just my actual views. And you don't need to exaggerate. You can be more intellectually honest. Another thing is, if my model is paid subscriptions, I charge people $44 a month or $440 a year to get these emails. It's kind of tough to say, oh, I'm profiting it by trading it and I'm trying to charge you to get the email. It's like you pick one model or the other. You can't really do both. And finally, I don't always view my emails as I don't view them as short recommendations. I'm trying to be intellectually honest and highlight situations where companies are either hurting customers or misleading investors. And sometimes you can be doing that, but you might be a good short-term trade. You might go up before you go down. So I don't view it as these are I'm making explicit short calls. I view it as I'm really good at the early stages of digging. And if you're a hedge fund interested in finding potential short ideas, subscribe to my newsletter. And twice a month, you'll get an off the beaten path idea and you'll be able to hit the ground running and have the first 5 innings of research done. But it won't be as fully baked as like an activist short report saying short now for these reasons.
Right. Okay. So that's perfect on your background. I guess maybe a good place to jump into the newsletter would be to talk about care.com. And I think this seems to be where you made a name for yourself and it kind of puts you on the map. So I think maybe before you had even started the newsletter, you were at Stanford when you wrote the report on care.com. So could you maybe tell us about how you figured out there was some shady stuff going on and how that story played out?
Chase, absolutely. So care.com is the largest babysitting platform in the US. They were a big publicly traded company 3 or 4 years ago when I started looking into them. And basically, I had a friend who was a babysitter on the site. And she's like, it just seems a little off. You should like check it out. It just seems a little weird. So I start digging in. At first, I look at lawsuits against the company and I see they've been sued 3 or 4 times when families hired a care.com babysitter and the babysitter like killed their kid and had a criminal history, or just like they discovered the person had a criminal history after they started stealing from them. It was just like, well, you say you're vetting people, but all these families are suing you for these like unvetted people. And then I looked at local news reporting and there was a lot of local news reports like convicted felon babysits kid and like leaves her or goes drunk driving with her, or just like crazy stories from care.com. And I'm like, wait, this doesn't seem all right. And then I decided to test care.com screening for myself, whether or not they actually screen their babysitters by signing up as Harvey Weinstein. So I took a photo of Harvey Weinstein, his name, I made up an address, I made up a social security number, I consented to their background check, and they said, well, we'll get back to you within 24 to 48 hours on whether or not you're approved. And I'm like, okay, there's no way they approve Harvey Weinstein because they're doing the background check. And then to my amazement, 48 hours later, it's hello, Harvey. And I, of course, am documenting the whole process and taking screenshots, and they upgrade me to the like second level of authenticity. Once I just link a fake Facebook account, I was able to say I was CPR certified. It was just like clear they weren't doing the background checks they claimed to be doing. So you get that. And then I write a little article about it and post about this on Twitter, and the stock falls a little, a board member resigns, and the co-founder of the company calls Stanford and is like, hey, doesn't contact me, calls Stanford, my college, and is like, this student is causing all this trouble, blah, 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 blah. And for whatever political reason, you know, three Stanford alums are on Care.com's board. Google, the largest shareholder of Care.com, has a lot of ties to Stanford, and their CFO is on the Stanford board. And the dean of students emails me and it's like, we have to meet to talk about your violations of our Wi-Fi policy. And I go meet with Stanford, and the dean of students is like, well, you violated Care.com's terms of service, and you did this while using Stanford's Wi-Fi by making the fake Harvey Weinstein account. This is a very serious violation. You could be suspended, you could be investigated, but you know, if you delete your article, none of this will happen. And I'm like, I'm not deleting my article. And they're like, well, you have to. And I'm like, I'm not deleting the article. And then they email me, well, you could be investigated. And I'm like, I'm not deleting the article, but thanks for putting it in an email. And then I keep using Stanford Wi-Fi to research Care.com. I file FOIA requests with every state attorney general for consumer complaints against Care.com. I get like hundreds of pages of complaints on how they're overbilling customers, making it impossible to cancel, faking the background checks, other safety issues. I write another article about them. I send it to like 100 reporters, literally cold email 100 reporters. One of them was at the Wall Street Journal, and then the Wall Street Journal starts an investigation, and 9 months later, there's a front page story about Care.com, and there are safety issues, and now like 8 kids have been killed by Care.com babysitters, many of whom had previous criminal histories that should have been caught somewhere in the process. The stock falls, the CEO, CFO, and general counsel all resigns. The dean of students also resigns, and the company gets taken private by IAC. And the good thing is IAC like really did implement new, better safety checks, and I think turned the company around. So that was all good. And the good thing is I got a little mention in the Wall Street Journal. Everybody knew I was the Care.com guy. So that gave me a lot of credibility and a few thousand Twitter followers, which then I could use to start the bear cave, and just gave me some weight to throw around.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. And then what's so interesting to me is the fact that all the people who are doing, you know, research on public companies, no one else was able to dig this stuff up. And here you are, how old were you at the time? 19, 20 years old.
Something like that, yeah.
Exactly. And you're able to dig this up. And once you figured it out, you stuck to your guns when Stanford was basically telling you that you were violating student conduct, all these things. I mean, it sounds like the decision not to take the article down was easy for you, but looking back, I mean, it could have been easy to think like they were going to kick you out or something. So I guess real quick before we go into the newsletter, what was going through your head and why were you so confident? And, you know,
well, I just knew it was wrong to take it down. And I'm like, I'm just like, I would regret doing it. And, you know, once you violate your ethics a little, you violate them a little more. And then it just doesn't work. You know, if you can't stand up as like a privileged 19-year-old, how are you going to stand up as like an adult? But I called my dad when this happened, and I'm like, you know, this is what they're saying. And he's like, oh my gosh, just take it down. Don't get kicked out. You don't know how the world works. Just trust me. You don't want to stir up too many feathers. I'm like, what are you talking about? He was pretty adamant that I take it down. But when he saw the Wall Street Journal article, I think he smirked a little. I was like, you probably made the right decision. But yeah, I also think though, it's like, it's a lot easier to do this maverick stuff and not be afraid if you grow up in a privileged family, if you're confident enough that you'll be financially fine either way, and you're not desperate. So I'm also kind of lucky to be in that position. And the sad thing is, like, a lot of people who might have the same spirit and heart and like intellect to go do it might not be able to be in the same position, which is kind of why I like to be independent so much, and wouldn't want to be part of a large organization generally, because that just kind of takes away your ability to follow your heart and soul if you're part of a large machine that can like tell you what to do.
All right. Well, I guess part of what's so great about you doing these interviews is when people hear your story, and probably in the scenario you laid out, more inclined to do that if the situation were ever to arise. So kudos to you. So you had mentioned that the care.com stuff was able to, give you a following and help you get the newsletter off the ground. Talk about starting it and how you're able to grow it, because it's pretty impressive how quickly you were able to go from 0 to 15,000 subscribers in less than like 18 months, right? I think there's people who write for a really long time and it's tough for them to get a following. So how deliberate were you in growing it, and what was your strategy and what was your process like?
So Chase, for almost any email newsletter, the way you grow it is through Twitter. So I got all my first 300 email subscribers by tweeting it out. Every week I would tweet out what was in the issue. So Twitter is kind of a really key thing. So along with growing my email newsletter from 0 to 17,000, I grew my Twitter audience from 2,000 to like 38,000. So you grow the Twitter as the top of funnel, you convert those to free email subscribers, you convert free to paid. Other stuff that helps email newsletters is getting a little bit of press. So I got a profile on Institutional Investor, which helped. I got like some minor media appearances that helps. Podcasts really help, because if somebody gets the more like intimate hour-long experience with an interview, they're more likely to sign up for a newsletter. Everyone should sign up for the Barricade. So all those things help. The other thing I found is like making lists and giving shout outs to other people is also really useful. So I've periodically made lists of here's the best 10 Twitter accounts to follow, here's the best 20, here's the best 50, here's the best 100. And when you do that, everybody on the list will retweet you and say, oh, thanks for making me number 72. Thanks for making me number 7. We're the officially ranked 8th best Twitter account to follow. All this. And that generates a lot of publicity and attention. There's kind of YouTube videos explaining how to maximize the use out of Twitter. Like if you make a good Twitter thread, that's likely to get you new followers. When I was just starting, I DM'd every single one of my like 5,000 followers being like, hey, sorry to bother you. I'm starting a newsletter about exposing corporate misconduct. You might like it. Here's a link. So I did that. And yeah, it's tough to, I think it's harder to go from 0 to 1,000 than it is to go from 1,000 to 10,000. So the tough part was the early days, but having a Twitter audience there helped me. It would be so much harder if you didn't have just a little bit of a Twitter. You don't need a huge following, but just having 1,000 or 2,000 people really makes a difference.
Gotcha. So of the research that you've done and the companies that you've written about and exposed maybe some wrongdoing, which one are you most proud of? I know it's hard to pick a favorite child. Maybe can you walk us through the story and the impact that it had?
Let me think for 1 second, because there's a lot, and
It's a tough question on the spot.
Part of the benefit, if you write about 2 companies every month, there's going to be a lot of companies. One that sticks out to my mind that I'm really proud of is Root Insurance. They were a recent IPO last year, big company, $5-10 billion company. And their whole thing was car insurance through an app. And the app would track your location 24/7 for 2 weeks. And by doing this, they said they could underwrite car insurance better and give you lower rates. What they claimed is that the app could track you while you drive. So they could see if you were braking too fast, the areas you drove, the times you drove, your turning radius, just based on your phone's location, which in theory would lead to better underwriting. But I this all started when I saw like people complain on Twitter about like getting price hikes from Root during the middle of a pandemic. And I'm like, well, if you're pricing it on how people drive less in a pandemic. So why are you like charging them more? So I go to regulators and ask for like consumer complaints against Root through the Freedom of Information Act. And there was just tons. And it was always like around two issues. One, Root seemed to consistently be hiking prices for their customers, car insurance rates, 30-40%, even during the pandemic when no one's driving. And they'd say, oh, well, the weather's getting worse, or the cost of repairs in your area is getting worse. And that might be true in some areas, but it can't be true everywhere that the weather's getting worse. So that like, and then also along with that, they made it really difficult to cancel. So you'd get these crazy letters of like lawyers writing their state attorney general being like, my client speaks Spanish and she just can't figure it out how to cancel. And they don't have a phone number and they don't have Spanish speakers. So we can't cancel this. And just a lot of people, an old person's like, I canceled it. And then they kept billing me and here's the receipts. And like, and then sometimes you get to see the correspondence between the company and the attorney general. And, the company basically admitted, yeah, we overcharged her and we're going to refund this like old lady $80 after like a year of complaining. And that just like makes your blood boil a little, like stop screwing people over. But the market, of course, doesn't get this because they're too focused on financials. So they're seeing up and to the right, oh, well, the revenue keeps increasing. The revenue per user keeps increasing. Well, that's because you're screwing them over with bad car insurance and making it difficult to cancel. And they're like, the churn's a little high. Well, I'm like, it would be so much higher if they actually had like a reasonable cancellation policy. But like, you know, I'm sure your models, you can like do it. So, you know, that was one where I felt like all the analysts who use models on Wall Street see it one way versus someone who actually understands what this company is doing sees it another. And I wrote it and I think it got a pretty strong reception. And that kind of highlights the work I love doing the most, where I can just go to a story that Wall Street loves and say, actually, this company is hurting consumers badly. And in the long run, a company with all unhappy customers who have other options like isn't going to do well, even if your models say it is.
Right. Yeah, no, it certainly has that element of, you know, sticking up for what's right. And it seems like that's a common theme through just the things that we've talked about so far. And so that's on the, you know, corporate misconduct side of things. But recently you published positively on Twitter stock, which is a change in pace from what you usually do. And can you tell us about that? And should we expect to see maybe some more positive research coming out of the bear cave moving forward?
So Chase, first, none of this is financial advice. Twitter is like personally a 75% position for me, and I own the stock and call options, and no one should ever get that concentrated. I'm a unique case, so I'm really biased here. I'm talking my book, not financial advice. What excites me about Twitter is historically it's been a social media platform that makes money from ads. Now they're launching an array of new products that I think are going to be really successful for monetization. The one I'm most excited about is Super Follows, which lets any account with more than 10,000 followers over the age of 18 charge users extra to get extra premium content that's behind a paywall. So that can be paywall tweets, it can be a private spaces audio event, it can be a link to other content. Potentially a newsletter. And I think that this Super Follows business, once it's rolled out, likely in the next month or two, is going to be just an instant hit with so many online creators. I know the email newsletter business. I know that almost every email newsletter needs Twitter and gets 50 to 80% of their traffic from Twitter. So of course, if all your audience is on Twitter and coming from Twitter, you're going to either embed your newsletter in the Super Follows business or have a separate Super Follows business to provide extra content. It's the perfect way to interact with super fans. I also just think it's going to be popular with a lot of other online creators just from knowing Twitter and the online community. Twitter's also launching a lot of other new products like Blue, like Topics, like Spaces, e-commerce. Twitter has a lot of room to run there. But I don't think the market's giving them any credit for it, even though I think it's going to be very profitable and make an impact. So that was the first part. I'm happy to talk more about Twitter and answer your questions. Now, the second part on whether I'm going to write more, I'm interested in companies that are like, hurting customers, misleading investors. I'm also like kind of interested in long tech ideas. Like with the money I get from the Bear Cave, I usually invest them in tech companies, like typically $1 to $5 billion. But Twitter's kind of my main thing now. So every time I do one of these long ideas, I get really mixed feedback. I get some subscribers saying, hey, I love this, you should do more like it. And I get others saying, this is going to be like a one-time instant, and you're going to go back to the normal. So I don't know like where most of my subscribers fall, because literally always within one of these like long ideas, I get two people reach out, one hating it, one loving it, and being like, I like the old Bear Cave, I like the new Bear Cave. So I got to make the call once, but my guess is like once per quarter, I might highlight an interesting company I like, and the 5 other premium reports are going to be normal Bear Cave critical reports.
Gotcha. Well, for what it's worth, I liked the piece you did on Twitter. So, so one of the things that I thought was interesting about Twitter, though, is that at one point on Twitter, you were sort of aggregating feedback to pass along to management from other users. And I thought this was super interesting because in a way it was like some form of activist investing where you were taking the value generation into your own hands, as opposed to like investing in a company and waiting for management to create value for you. Is that what you were going for? And like, how do you think about creating value as a minority shareholder?
I don't know that I think it's tough to create value as a minority shareholder. Like I did say, everybody, what are your ideas to improve Twitter? I put it in the list and hoped it went viral. And like a few engineers at Twitter liked it. I just more kind of did it because I saw that the Twitter engineers were being very receptive to public feedback, and they've taken this view, let's be receptive. And I thought this would be helpful. I think one thing you can do, especially if you're independent, is aggregate ideas from everybody, spend a few hours to clean it up, and then share it again with everybody. So you just take the information everybody has, organize it, and share it again with your audience. I'm not really doing that because I think that'll move Twitter stock an extra penny or two. I'm just doing it to be helpful. But it's also cool just to see how sometimes if you use a product too much, you can have tunnel vision or not see all the aspects of it. It also showed me like, hey, these are all a ton of like little premium features Twitter could include in their Twitter Blue premium service.
Gotcha. Okay, so I think we hit on the platform. I guess what does the future for the Bear Cave look like? And I think in some other interviews you had mentioned that at some point in the future you might be interested in opening up your own fund. Are you any closer to that goal? And I'm just curious, like, what do you have in the works?
It's not a real short-term goal of mine to open a hedge fund. One thing, I don't know if this is true, but I feel it's true, is with hedge funds, you kind of only get one shot, especially if you don't have like a billionaire dad. It's like you get one chance. If you fail, it's tough to start a second one. At least that's how I think of it. So you only want to shoot when you're ready, and it's easier to start with more in assets. So, starting at 23, why not just wait till I'm 25 and I have more of a following? And frankly, I would do better, and I'm smarter, and I understand the markets more, and I could raise more money. The other thing is, like, sometimes I joke with people, if I had 2 lives, I'd want to live one running a hedge fund, becoming a billionaire, and living that life. But if you only have one life, I'm not sure that's the life I'd want to live. I kind of want to do something that has maybe more human interaction. And hedge fund managers can do a lot for the world, especially if you're like Warren Buffett and donate all the money at the end. But I could see myself honestly becoming more of a social activist, where I use the Bear Cave not just to highlight public companies, but private companies or regulations that don't make sense, and suggest regulations, and kind of morph it into more like, here's like the corruption and societal problems that I'm good at investigating and publishing about, and kind of making it more of like a journalism activism thing than a more stock focused thing. That's something that appeals to me with the Bear Cave, and just become this guy that's like quirky 23, 24-year-old with a community focused on like fighting corruption and the bad companies. Because I think there's like a crisis of fakeness in the US, and there's not enough genuine people and real people. And once you get good at like investigating it, like I feel so bad for so many people. Like, I'll give you an example. This is a little ramble, Chase,
It's
but
okay.
it's like I was investigating a used car dealership, and they would give loans to customers and like cars to customers. And a woman bought a car for like 20 grand, a used car, and she didn't know what she was doing, so she got ripped off. And then she like went home and she looked up the Kelly Blue Book value, and it was $4,000. And all her friends are like, "You just got scammed because this car is worth 4 grand and you paid 20 grand." And she writes a letter to her state attorney general. And I read it. That's how I know about it. I filed a FOIA request just for all complaints against this company. And it's like, yeah, I got scammed and I didn't know what I was doing. And I never like really bought a car on my own because my husband died and like all this. And then the state attorney general, of course, hates this type of stuff. So they send a letter to the company, and the company responds, and the company responds, and they're like, "Yeah, well, we sold a $4,000 car for $20,000. That's true, but we upgraded the lights, we cleaned the engine, we put new tires on. But we see how this can be misinterpreted, and we like being a good corporate citizen, so we're gonna waive $15,000 off this person's loan." And I'm like, oh my God, so you're basically admitting you screw people over for a living, but at least this one person got like $15,000. But it's like, how much more of that is there in the world? Like tons of people who just don't like make a like small mistake in 1 hour, screw over like their entire year or 2 years, and it's just causing so much pain because the corporation decides to be like stupid. And I think I'm effective at exposing that, so I kind of like that.
Definitely, yeah. No, that's something that I've noticed as well recently, having moved having moved to New York, and yeah, maybe we should take a look at my building management company because they've been giving me a hard time.
Oh,
Just
I'm sorry. Yeah, there's so much of this in the world. And the problem is it's just getting worse and worse and worse because everybody can point fingers to everyone else. And it's like, oh, okay. The only people who get screwed are the people who aren't like currently an elite. But
That's right. Well, Edwin, I mean, that's all the questions I had prepped for you, and I really enjoyed this. And before we go, I do want to say that like part of the reason why I wanted to have the call is that I think what people should take away from your story and what's unique about you is your ability to sort of just like put yourself out there and not take no for an answer. And part of the reason why I wanted you to share the networking stories at the beginning is just because I think that's like a perfect display of, that case in point. And it's probably why you've seen as much success as you have. So thank you so much for your time. And if people are interested in following Edwin, you can find him on Twitter at StockJabber, and I'll also link his account details below. Thanks, Edwin.
yes, thanks so much for having me, Chase.
Take care.